Thanks, TJ. Good morning, everybody. Happy to be here. Thanks for inviting me. I'm really delighted. I noticed on your website that it identified me as writing for the Washington Post and not the Washington Times. I'm not offended. Maybe they are. Slight difference. Just wanted to point that out. I'm really happy to come and talk about my Tet Offensive project and also talk about current events. And first I'd like to address Tet and my book, This Time We Win. A question I frequently get is, where did you get that title, This Time We Win? Actually, it came from Vietnam veterans. I would talk to them about what I was doing and say, I'm writing a book on the Tet Offensive. And many times they would say, do we win this time? So hence the title, This Time We Win. It goes along with the other old cliche that you hear from the vets, that we were winning when I left, they say. So yeah, part of the reason I wrote the book was to try to get the truth out about what happened in Vietnam and to honor the men and women who won that war for us before the politicians threw it away. You frequently see Tet in the headlines these days. Whenever anything bad happens in the world, terrorists do some kind of attack or insurgents have some kind of spectacular bombing or something, you'll see a pundit or a commentator say, this is just like the Tet Offensive. Iraq, Afghanistan, wherever. I saw a headline about Tet referring to northern Mexico, that some kind of Tet Offensive was going on there. Time magazine said that the WikiLeaks document dump was just like the Tet Offensive. You know, I don't quite see how you can make the analogy, but anyway, the point is that Tet is out there. And the problem with this is that every time you say Tet, what you're really saying is defeat. What you're saying is that whatever we're involved in is like Vietnam, it's a quagmire, we can't win, and so forth. And in fact, the bad guys out there, the terrorists and the insurgents, talk openly about the Tet Offensive in Vietnam as their model. This is how they want to win. Because terrorists and insurgents are weak. They can't really defeat us on battlefields. They can't defeat our forces militarily. That's why they're terrorists. That's why they're insurgents. If they could fight us head to head, they would do it, but they can't. So instead, what they have to do is try to attack our national will. They have to try to attack the thinking of decision makers. Because in the end, like in Vietnam, if you can get the decision makers to conclude that the war is no longer worth it, then they'll leave. And Osama bin Laden and other people like that have made explicit statements saying this is what they're trying to do. So whenever they do something that's spectacular, and then whenever somebody on our side says this is just like the Tet Offensive, we're really playing into their hands. So part of what I wanted to do in this project was get people to stop doing that, because it doesn't help us, number one, and number two, it's not really true when people compare things to the Tet Offensive. Most of the time, it has nothing to do with the Tet Offensive. Now, what most educated people know about Tet, or what you see in most history books, is that it was a surprise attack by the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong against largely symbolic targets in Vietnam, intended to turn the American people against the war and drive Lyndon Johnson to the bargaining table. And of those four things, I found out that none of them are true. So let me just go down some of those with respect to the Tet myth. For example, that it was a surprise attack. It certainly took a lot of people by surprise when it happened, but mainly like journalists in Washington and folks in the United States who weren't paying attention. They were taken by surprise. But people on the ground in South Vietnam knew it was coming. We had captured documents months in advance that detailed what the enemy was planning. The US Embassy, a month before the attack, gave a briefing in which they talked about what they thought was coming. If you go through January 1968, which was the month before the attack happened, which took place right at the end of January, our forces went on progressively greater states of alert. Our decision makers talked about the coming attack. There was a story 3 days before the attack in the Washington Post talking about the expected spring offensive that was coming. And then furthermore, the enemy, when they finally launched their attack, because of miscommunication, some of their guys attacked 2 days too early. Some of their guys attacked the day before they were supposed to attack. When the attack finally came, the day it was supposed to come, the whole country, South Vietnam, was on alert. So how do you get a surprise attack out of that? Well, the point is that the press settled on a storyline. They decided, since some of the people in Washington were surprised, everybody must have been surprised. They asked the Johnson administration, if you knew about it in advance, why didn't you tell us? The Johnson administration said, well, you know, the fact that we knew the enemy's plans doesn't mean we're going to tell you guys. Then the enemy will know that we know what they're up to. We were planning a trap for them. But because of the credibility gap, they said, oh, Lyndon Johnson, you're just lying to us, so you didn't really know anything. It was intelligence failure. And so they stuck with that storyline that we were surprised. In fact, we weren't. The second point about symbolic targets. The Tet Offensive was a large-scale, last-ditch attempt by the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong to win the Vietnam War, involving tens of thousands of their troops and going over a number of days. The plan was to foment this massed uprising in South Vietnam because they thought the South Vietnamese people were raring to go and would join the communist revolution if only they had the encouragement. So they're going to take the cities, foment this uprising, and then the rationale for the American presence in South Vietnam would be undercut, and we would have to leave. That was their plan. And it was a very bad plan. It had no chance of succeeding. It was based on a lot of flawed premises, particularly that the South Vietnamese people would join in their attack, which they didn't want to do and, in fact, didn't do. But because the plan was so flawed, people on our side, analysts in the CIA, looked at it and said, this plan has no chance of succeeding. Therefore, they must be up to something else. What else could they be up to? Well, it must be a symbolic attack on our will, like they're just trying to make a point. And actually, the CIA analysis on the first day of the attack said, they aren't really trying to win, they're just trying to make a point. And so this got into the Johnson administration's talking points, and the President and Secretary of Defense, McNamara, made this point before the press. They said, well, the enemy is just attempting a symbolic attack. So the press said, okay, fine, it's symbolic. Now that's really critical, because if you do an attack, if you're the enemy, and you attack, and you're defeated, it's easy to see that you're defeated. You're not holding the ground, you didn't reach your objectives, and so forth. But if you say an attack is just supposed to be symbolic, that you're just trying to make a point, who's to say who won and lost? How do you judge winning and losing if it's all up in the air, if it's all up to perceptions? See, that's a battlefield that they can win on because they're just arguing about the perceptions of it. And so, for example, when they attacked the US Embassy in Saigon, which was the major news story of the Tet Offensive, in the overall enemy plan, it was hardly relevant. It was just this little attack. But in terms of the news coverage, in terms of the symbolism of the US Embassy being attacked by 19 Viet Cong sappers, that became a big deal. Now, their objective, their orders were seize the embassy, hold it, and wait for reinforcements. Thank you. And they didn't. I mean, they didn't seize the embassy. The reinforcements weren't coming. Most of them were killed, and that was the end of that. But because of this argument over the symbolism of it, it became a great victory for them because, you know, in symbolic terms, it was an attack on US prestige. Also, an argument erupted over, did they actually seize the embassy building proper, or were they just in the grounds? They actually didn't get in the building, but Peter Arnett said he overheard someone say they were, and so he reported that, and then the administration denied it, and then people said, well, it's just Lyndon Johnson lying again, and so this great debate broke out. So instead of covering the fact that the enemy were wiped out, there was this argument over did they hold the building, there was this argument over what was the symbolism, and so forth. And so things like that made this symbolic attack storyline solidify. And again, it sort of handed them a victory, because if you're arguing on the basis of symbolism, who's to say who won and lost?